Well, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers for making this happen and for bringing us to Dubai. And I also want to thank the Embassy of Luxembourg for supporting this enterprise. As legend has it, the field of artificial intelligence was founded in 1956, resting on the confident premise of the so-called Dartmouth proposal that human intelligence, and I quote, can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it, end of citation. Even though few scientists and scholars share this optimistic take on the prospect of brain simulation, AI has been inspired by the cognitive sciences, another brainchild of the Cold War 1950s. And yet, more than 65 years later, we still do not agree on how to define human intelligence, let alone how to measure it. Moreover, our knowledge of how processes of cognition work has so far remained rather limited. How then can AI possibly go beyond our modest self-reflexive insights and simulate complex mental capabilities that remain more or less intransparent? Based in part on my research on the crossroads between conceptions of memory in cultural studies and the cognitive sciences, my contribution explores how the scope of artificial intelligence and its presumed potential and immense market value have been driven to a considerable degree by our narrowly confined sense of human cognition. Despite the fact that the so-called hard problem of consciousness, the question how brain becomes mind, remains unsolved, if not unsolvable, cognition research has gained much cultural, economic, and scholarly prominence, especially from the 1990s decade of the brain onward. One consequence is that concepts like consciousness, mind, will, and belief became renaturalized. How, I wonder, does this tendency to naturalize our conception of the human play out in the field of AI? And how has AI in turn further shifted and transformed our sense of what it means to be human? While the main part of my argument interrogates these questions, my afterthought briefly figures in face recognition and reflects on how AI does or does not account for intersubjectivity, a crucial dimension of what makes us human. Outsourcing the brain, optimizing the body. All stories begin in our endings. Mark O'Connell opens his 2017 book, To Be a Machine, Adventures Among Cyborgs, the Utopians, Hackers, and the Futurists Solving the Modest Problem of Death. And I quote, "We invent them because we die. As long as we have been telling stories," he writes, "we have been telling them about the desire to escape our human bodies, to become something other than the animals we are," end of citation. This desire to transcend human nature has driven religious beliefs, philosophical thought, motivations of science and research, as well as modes of storytelling for millennia. It informs the field of artificial intelligence since its emergence in the 1950s, and it dominates transhumanism. In turn, both have inspired multiple utopian and dystopian narratives of our disembodied future as a superintelligence, to use Nick Bostrom's term, or singularity, the concept Ray Kurzweil prefers. AI and transhumanism are two different matters, of course, and we need to clearly differentiate their faith, goals, and possible futures. My concern, though, is with the common ground they tread, the aspiration to enhance human life, and a seeming certainty what that actually means. To complicate matters, I like to figure in cognitive science as a field that has fundamentally informed this conversation and its ongoing shifts. Inspired as much as enabled by developments in computer science, computation, and digitization, current visions of the future of human subjectivity toy with the outsourcing of our brains. They're unhinging from our inadequate bodies, bodies incapable to compete with smart machines and still marked with an expiration date. At the same time, the perceived boundary between human agents and their technological environment has become increasingly porous, and the interfaces between human bodies and their digitized appendages have moved to the forefront of scientific inquiry and marketing strategies. This development was driven as much by biotechnologies and media as extensions of man, to call on McLuhan, as by notions of the human brain as computer or network, or by newest brain-computer interface technologies. What consequently we did observe in recent decades is the interplay of two interdependent tendencies. While privileging and outsourcing the brain as the centerpiece of human subjectivity, both scientific inquiry and cultural practices flaunt an ambition to optimize the human body and augment our powers of perception and cognition through technological enhancements of our sense organs and our neural capacities. These interrelated aspirations have managed to channel immense amounts of resources into cognitive science and AI research. And they have also fundamentally and in multiple manners, particularly by agenda setting and practices of defunding, affected our own work as scholars in the humanities and social sciences. Interestingly enough, despite our naturalized notions of consciousness and mind, mental processes remain overdetermined by the concept of mind as computer. Disseminated from the 1950s onwards as a machine which stores information to be retrieved at a later moment. The so-called information processing or artificial intelligence approach of the cognitive sciences transformed the computer into the master trope of communication and information systems, and into a model explanation for how the human mind works. However, the idea that computers possess some kind of intelligence is based on a misunderstanding of how humans use language and cognize. It rests, as philosopher Ursula Hoffmann explains, on the erroneous assumption, and I quote, that cognizing creatures collect information on an objectively given reality with objects of distinct attributes and properties in order to construct models or representations stored to be retrieved and translated into language and thought processes. End of citation. As a consequence, by the 1990s, the paradigm of the computer and the representational computational theory of mind made way for the parallel distributed processing approach, also called connectionism or neural networks approach. PDP replaces concepts of seriality with notions of simultaneous processing, synchronicity, connectivity, and reversibility. Embracing the trope of the network, cognitive science adapted a central concept of contemporaneous cultural discourse. This appropriation is indicative not so much of an advanced state of knowledge. Rather, it highlights the ways in which new technologies mold, visualize, and communicate knowledge ecologies. Ultimately, it remains secondary whether computer or network is the more poignant trope for how the human mind seems to work. More relevant in this context is, first, that it is us humans who ascribe to machines mental conditions, and secondly, that as soon as mind meant neural network, mind and brain became identical. As a consequence, the dualism of body and mind seemed to dissolve, yet was in fact reinscribed while self-consciousness became an epiphenomenon of neural processes. At the same time, though, the notion of mind as computer and the linguistic register of computer technologies have proven highly sustainable in AI and transhumanism. All the while, the methods of cognitive science informing AI, such as measuring action potentials in the brain, remain atomistic. Imaging techniques such as the positron emission tomography certainly do not enable us to observe the brain thinking, as neurobiologist Hans-Jochen Heinze claimed. Instead, on accounts of singular activity in select local areas of the brain, cognition research keeps building big claims. Accordingly, its popularized versions disseminated by best-selling authors such as Steven Pinker and Oliver Sacks, as much as by advertisements for products from food to cars and washing machines to insurances, suggests that humans are virtually identical with functioning brains. I brought a couple of these advertisements. This is for water. This is for washing machines. This is for a bank. This is for Mercedes. And this is something else. So the brain figures as the representation of the human and how we actually operate. With its dematerialized notion of subjectivity and the demise of the human body and brain, AI carries this phase even further. Concerned with artificial as opposed to natural minds, AI retains a retrotopian conceptions of humans as brain machines. And, and with this term retrotopia, I'm referencing Zygmunt Bauman's book. I can say more about this if there's questions in the discussion. This dated vision of man as machine dominates transhumanist discourse even more evidently. Its most optimistic protagonists foresee what they call whole brain emulation, that is, the downloading of our brain processes as data and the subsequent production of substrate-independent minds. As of now, digital technologies marketed as tools assisting the optimization of the human body aim at outsourcing part of the human brain's capacities and functions. What cognitive science and AI share is a limited insight in how we cognize. Cognitive science still knows very little about how our brain works, and what little we know, writer Siri Hustvedt poignantly remarks, often becomes an excuse to extrapolate endlessly. Likewise, though flexibility is a central feature of human intelligence, the algorithms AI currently operates with remain very simple and inflexible, as neuroscientist Laurens Wiskott notes. In addition, based on available sets of data, they reproduce common assumptions and discriminate against what and who is not considered the norm, as face recognition software, for instance, does. These very limitations legitimize pleas for more research funds at the expense of the humanities, which in turn have adapted by engaging in the digital humanities. In April 2013, for instance, 23 years after US President George H.W. Bush inaugurated the 1990s Decade of the Brain, the Obama administration announced the BRAIN Initiative, and BRAIN stands for Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. Marketed as the exploration of a new frontier, this public-private research initiative proclaimed having potential to do for neuroscience what the Human Genome Project did for genomics by supporting the development and application of innovative technologies that can create a dynamic understanding of brain function. End of citation. Yet the US is certainly not singular when it comes to such aspirations, driven by a melange of cognitive science, AI, and transhumanism. The Human Brain Project, for instance, a billion-dollar flagship initiative of the European Commission, promises to build a replica of the human brain and has proven particularly ambitious. Reconstructions and simulations of the brain, so the claim goes, provide a radically new approach to neuroscience, helping to fulfill gaps in the experimental data, connecting different levels of biological organization, and enabling in silico experiments impossible in the laboratory. The project's agenda to reconstruct the brain in silico, that is via computational analysis and simulation, somehow echoes the transhumanist fantasies of mind uploading. However, deeply invested in computationalism and computational neuroscience, the Human Brain Project can only simulate what we already know about the brain. In part due to the self-referentiality of the complex task, that knowledge remains quite minute. After all, using our brain to investigate this very brain, we're both subject and object of the inquiry. The primary goal driving both the US Brain Initiative and the European Human Brain Project is to further develop and enhance computer technologies. That goal has guided AI and transhumanism too. Little attention, though, as critics of the Human Brain Project note, is being paid to the question how thought and behavior evolve from nerve cell activity. In other words, the hard problem of consciousness, as philosopher David Chalmers called the unresolved question of how brain becomes mind, keeps disappearing from our radar repeatedly. In fact, by hailing the transformation of brain material into disembodied minds or mind uploading, transhumanism has done away with the difference between brain and mind altogether, just like cognitive science's sense of brain as mind did, a notion that AI adopted and celebrates. This is my last and short part. Face-to-face with the robot, singularity, face recognition, intersubjectivity. The claim that our brains would be better off without their ill-equipped fleshy containers, some transhumanists consider the human body as dead format, an obsolete technology, is certainly not new. In the 1940s, inspired by reading of the ancient Greek automata, O'Connell recalls Leonardo da Vinci designed and built a robotic knight. Taking matters a step further, Descartes' 1630s treatise on man was predicated on the idea that our bodies are essentially machines animated by a divine infusion of spirit and soul. By the early 21st century, transhumanists like Anders Sandberg developed the vision of getting uploaded of the conversion of human minds into software as central to the ideal of transcending human limitations. Or as Kurzweil wrote in his book, "The singularity is near when humans transcend biology," and I quote, "An emulation of the human brain running on an electronic system would run much faster than our biological brains." End of citation. Dmitry Iskov even speaks of a transfer of an individual's personality to a more advanced non-biological carrier. The seemingly paradoxical yet synchronic dynamics of outsourcing brain power and enhancing ill-equipped bodies operate in and boost a neoliberal or late capitalist economic framework that invests in who or what proves most fit. In that framework, humanity supposedly progresses while new feudalist socioeconomic hierarchies get reinforced. Even though AI, as of yet, fails to master processes of hierarchical decision-making, a key component of human intelligence, inequality keeps surging, and face-to-face human interaction in the three-dimensional realm is in consistent decline. In this media environment evolved the mold of an individual or singularity who is both self-reliant and interactively extended, a subject who affirms his or her agency by singular consumption choices, including choices about AI applications. All the while, though, according to information technology expert Ki Pauchi, 40% of all products that sell the label AI, with the label AI do not actually make use of AI. As this singular subject takes shape, social capital gets devalued while we are increasingly putting a premium on self-reliance, self-concern, and an antisocial edge of self-assertion. Deprived of team spirit, solidarity, and sociality, we may thus indeed be enacting versions of the very singularities that transhumanism foresees and that sociologist Andreas Reckwith interrogates with much insight. Yet humans become subjects and processes of recognition. The very moment my face gets recognized by another human subject, I am accounted for. I become I facing a you. No surprise, therefore, that face recognition constitutes the highest capability of the human visual system. No surprise either that much research capitalizes on face recognition technologies which yield sufficient revenue. At the same time, our increased reliance on these technologies and on digital communication foregrounds that we are all suspect to a certain degree and at least partially replaceable, even if some are more dispensable than others. Accordingly, finding oneself face-to-face with a robot is no longer a situation restricted to sci-fi scenarios or feature films like Maria Schrader's 2021 Ich bin dein Mensch, I am your man, where as part of an experiment, the scientist Alma engages with a humanoid robot trained to fulfill all her desires. In China, robots recently carried the Olympic torch part of its way. And columnist Harald Martenstein jokes that sex robots, supposedly capable to simulate emotions believably, should be granted to operate on a consent mode too. More significant though, limited to certain functions, robots necessarily design and contour the faces and sentiments they supposedly read and simulate. They also bear witness to the fact that AI, cognitive science, and transhumanism have newly raised and replied to the question what in fact distinguishes humans from intelligent machines. In 1968, Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, held that, and I quote, empathy evidently exists only within the human community, whereas intelligence to some degree can be found throughout every phylum and order, including the Arachnida. End of citation. Meanwhile, we see a rising research interest in digital empathy and digital intersubjectivity, as well as resistance in the arts, as in Schrader's movie, or the production We Are in Time by British playwright and director Pamela Carter, for instance, a play that interrogates health issues as an intersubjective affair. Donating a heart may enable a dying person to live longer and make death interlink with celebrations of life. Not I live on eternally as a singular outsourced brain, another fully human body and mind does. Now there's an idea, admittedly not a very new one either. Thank you very much.